Very good. Okay. Lipid-soluble hormones is what we're going to go on to next. We talked about water-soluble hormones that basically require a receptor on the surface. Okay? These lipid-soluble agents can use receptors on the surface, but a lot of times they will actually penetrate into the cell and have their direct effects inside the cell. Okay? The steroid hormones are the ones that are usually produced in the adrenal cortex. Okay? Things like androgens, okay, which is your aldosterone, all tend to affect the kidney in this way. Okay? But androgens as well are important. Okay? Glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids are also forms of lipid-soluble hormones. Okay? The other ones that are important is thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormones are lipid-soluble agents. Okay? Now, one thing that I want you to sort of take away from this discussion is that when you're talking about lipid-soluble hormones, they're much more powerful. Okay? They can have significant effects diffusely throughout the body, and they actually have effects at the DNA level that's actually very rapid. Okay? It diffuses across the plasma membrane, and it binds to cytoplasmic or nuclear receptors, and eventually leading to activation of RNA polymerase, which then, of course, helps in translation, and then you have DNA transcription and translation also taking place. Now, the structure and functions that we're going to talk about next is looking at how the hypothalamus, which is ultimately to a certain degree controlled indirectly by the cortex, so the emotional level of the brain, and eventually leads to activation of these hormone releases from the hypothalamus, which then affects usually the anterior pituitary, which then affects the thyroid, parathyroid, thymus, adrenals, pancreas, as well as the reproductive organs. The hypothalamic pituitary axis is a very important system. It's one of the most important systems for control of the autonomic nervous system. It's basically critical for patient stability. Okay? And there's actually disease processes where the person actually has that area damaged. Does anybody know the name of that? Is it? No. Mm-mm. All right, here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to give you a test question. I'm going to write it down. Let me have somebody's pen so I don't forget. Okay? What I'm going to ask you on the test is I'm going to ask you what clinical situation causes the basically the disconnect of the hypothalamus from the pituitary. Okay? And I'll give you a specific hint. Okay? It's usually found in women. Okay? Don't say it. Okay? If you know it, don't say it. Okay? It's going to be for the rest of the class to look it up. Okay? Try to work it out as an individual. It's got a person's name on it. Anterior pituitary usually, and both. It can affect both. It usually affects there's a disconnect in blood supply to this area. Yep, from the hypothalamus. Okay, usually because you've actually injured the blood vessels. Okay? So I'll make that a test question. I'll state 4 different diseases, and I expect you to figure out which one it is. Okay? The hypothalamus basically processes information that's coming from many different areas of the body. Okay? It takes sensory information, it takes cortical information, it takes emotional components to it, it takes memory, okay? It takes circadian visual readings of your basically outside environment, sun, and then determines from that what it should release in certain hormones at certain times of year. It even regulates, in a sense, it senses your temperature outside to try to internally regulate your internal environment. Okay? If you're living in a constantly hot environment, okay, your genetics over time will alter that person to become thinner, longer in hands, bigger hands. Okay? They'll have bigger ears, okay, and they tend to be thin with very long bones. If you go up in altitude or you go up in northern climates, hands get shorter, fingers get smaller, stubbier, okay, and people's ears get smaller, okay, and the person becomes stumpier. Lower legs, bigger mass in the middle, okay. And you have to ask yourself why, okay. It's because of genetic pressures, okay. Environmental pressures affect us just like any other animal, okay. We don't see that anymore because guess what? We have airplanes, we have trains, we have cars. So we're basically mixing all together, okay? Versus if you looked at us anciently, okay, even as little as 100 years ago, the chance of you walking outside your environment beyond 25 miles of where you were born was fairly small, okay? 90% of the population never walked beyond 25 miles away from where they were born at one time. That's literally less than 100 years ago, okay? So that sort of tells you that, of course, that environment is going to make a very big difference in those individuals, okay? And that's why if you look, if you go to certain countries, everybody will be blue-eyed, blonde, okay? Other countries, the skin color changes in density, okay? Usually the skin color changes as you go further and further into the tropics. The skin that's darker basically protects them against the sun. You know, the Irish immigrants have found that's out the hard way in Australia, which has the highest what? Highest skin cancer rate in the world, okay? Because you took a bunch of people that lived up in the northern climates who were basically white with freckles and put them down into the very hot tropical area and exposed them to high density of UV. And of course, now they're actually suffering from the consequence of that, okay? Now, the question is, you have to ask yourself, why do you have certain skin color? The skin color basically helps you in adaptive when you have low sun conditions, okay? The whiter you are, the more adapted you are to very low sun conditions. Your body will take the sunlight through it and will actually produce greater amounts of activated forms of vitamin D, okay? Versus if you're in a very tropical area, that does not take place if you're darker skinned, okay? You don't need it as much because you don't want that much degree of exposure. Where do you get rickets? Do you get rickets usually in warm environments? Answer is no. It's usually in cold environments. Okay, so again, because of low sunlight conditions that we have in northern climates. For the first time in my life, I know my genetic tree. You know, I know my genetic tree is mostly Irish and German. Okay, so and I lived almost all my life in tropics, and usually temperature of 98 degrees all the time. So when I went to Chicago for a year and a half where I taught, it was really interesting. It was the first time in my life actually I felt really comfortable. I never sweated. I was out there at 40 degrees wearing shorts, and people were looking at me like, "What, are you crazy?" And I'm going like, "Man, it feels like home. This feels like warm." Okay. My wife was, of course, freezing to death. She was Mediterranean origin, so she did not tolerate that very well. So different genetics make a huge difference in this mechanism, which is the hypothalamic pituitary axis, which is really responsible for actually maintaining your overall stability due to the environment externally. Okay. Now, the pituitary gland is the secondary processor. The primary processor is the hypothalamus. And the secondary mechanism of control is in the actual anterior and posterior gland. Okay? The anterior pituitary, though, is actually regulated by chemical mediators that are released from the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and then they drift down via blood supply down to eventually affect the anterior lobe. The posterior lobe is also not the same. Posterior lobe has actually an axonal contribution, which is what they show in this picture. Okay? They show that the actual nucleus is up here in the hypothalamus, but the axons travel all the way down here, and they release oxytocin and basically ADH, which are then hormones that go into your bloodstream. Okay? That's the hypophyseal connection. Okay? So that's actually a neuron connection. Okay? Versus the anterior pituitary is dependent on blood supply. Okay? The blood supply in here is very rich in the anterior pituitary. So you have a blood supply that comes around through up here, and then it travels around here. And it's also inside the organ. Okay? So when that chemical is released in here, it travels down here, and then it affects the cell, which then releases the next hormone. So it's a two-step hormone. Does that first hormone get into your bloodstream systemically? The answer is yes. TRH does get into your bloodstream. We can actually measure it. Okay? If it didn't get into your bloodstream, let's say if you had thyroid, let's say we're using thyroid. The thyroid releases the hormone up here in the hypothalamus, which is the thyroid-releasing hormone. And that goes down to here to cause thyroid-stimulating hormone to be released. So now you have two chemicals. And we can measure both. So you do know that it gets systemically into your system. Okay? Does TRH really have an effect on the thyroid gland? The answer is no. Okay? It really only has an effect on the anterior pituitary. Okay? So there's two systems. One's a vascular system, which is relatively okay. It's not super fast, but the real fast one is a posterior connection, which is that neural mechanism. Okay, so make sure you understand the difference. Okay, that's going to be a test question. One will be told is which one's anterior, which one's posterior, which one's neural based, which one is basically endocrine, where you have blood chemical reaction to effect, which is the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary, also known as the neural hypophysis system, I can never say that word right, okay, is basically the mechanism that I just told you, where the cell bodies are actually located here and here. Okay? That's where the actual cell body, which means that's where the nucleus is at, that's where the endoplasmic reticulum at, that's where the SR is at, that's where the Golgi apparatus is at, and that's where all the hormones are produced. Okay? The hormones have to be produced here, and they travel via vacuoles all the way down here, just like any other neuron. Okay? And this can actually become very similar if you think about it as a sympathetic nervous system having the effect on the adrenal. It's very similar. Okay? It causes that kind of effect. But the difference is that it doesn't really cause a cell to release it. Okay? There's no secondary cell there. It's not due to axon depolarization. It's the vacuole that has the hormone, which is antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin, are directly then distributed into the bloodstream from the posterior pituitary. There's no other secondary cells where it causes depolarization and causes that activity. So it's not that kind of mechanism. Okay? So there's only two things. It's synthesized in the supraoptic and the paraventricular cell nuclei of the hypothalamus. Again, when I told you before, what did nuclei mean? Cell bodies. Okay? And I'm not sure they'll ever ask you that question. If that's asked, it's pretty picky. Again, it's just one of those things that sometimes they might throw at it. If I was telling you if you're in medical school, I'd say, yeah, they're going to ask you that. Okay, but I think in your guys, you usually don't ask that question. So, but they've been getting more difficult every year, so that's why I throw it up there just in case. So you know it's a supraoptic or paraventricular nuclei. The two hormones that are released is where I think most of the money's at, in the sense of knowledge base that you need to know, is the antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Okay? Antidiuretic hormone is something that we're going to go over and over again when we talk about renal physiology and pathophysiology, because it's very important for the cortical cells, the cortical collecting duct cells, to hold back water. Okay? It's an antidiuretic hormone. It means it's going to stop, it's anti against diuresis. So it's going to hold water in. Okay? So antidiuretic hormone is very important for any forms of high levels of stress. If you know that you're going to be running, okay, one of the things that is going to be held really quick after you start running is ADH is going to start being secreted. So you'll notice that while you're running, you don't want to go to the bathroom. Okay? You're not going to urinate. Okay? When you stop running, that's when the body says, okay, well, it's time to dump stuff now. Now then you'll want to urinate. Okay? But usually while you're running, the antidiuretic hormone is trying to hold everything in, and it doesn't allow anything to come out of the kidney. Okay? Oxytocin, on the other hand, is the other emergency drug in your body, which is usually used for women at the time of partition, okay, when they deliver the baby. What keeps them alive and not hemorrhaging to death is because the uterus begins to contract very vigorously from the release of high levels of oxytocin by the posterior pituitary. Okay? If you don't have adequate secretion of oxytocin into the bloodstream, the woman's uterus stays atonic, which means it doesn't contract, and the patient may actually hemorrhage to death and die. Now, let's start with an example. Let's start with antidiuretic hormone. Okay? What I've done for you is, this is my drawing, okay, that I have for you. And I try to keep it in the sense of very visual oriented for people that are not they're not verbally or they'd learn more by writing. So instead, this is more visual format for those people, okay, which is what I am. So I do everything in boxes and for all things. So you see hypothalamus is the top one, followed by the next section, which is the posterior pituitary. And then you have the two target organs that are affected, which is the kidney and the blood vessels. Okay? Antidiuretic hormone becomes very important, mostly to the kidney. Okay? If you have to say which one of the mechanisms is by far the more important of these, of course it's going to be the kidney and its antidiuretic effect. Okay? Now, what is going to produce elevated levels of antidiuretic hormone? Remember, ADH is not produced inside the posterior pituitary. It's produced actually in the hypothalamus. Okay? So anything that causes this activation will then cause its release at the posterior pituitary point, where then it gets into the bloodstream. Okay? Things that will activate it are in green. Okay, the green arrows indicate activation, and the red arrows mean inhibition. Okay? The red arrows basically are the sensors that are inside, the green arrows are the sensors that activate, which are the osmoreceptors. Okay? Osmoreceptors are located inside the brain, which actually regulate the degree of water osmolarity in your system. So if you have increased osmolarity, it tends to indicate to the body that you're losing water. So ADH will then be released and produced at higher contents, and then will hopefully retain water. The other thing that also leads to activation is the cholinergic neurotransmitter activation. Things like stress, trauma, exercise, nausea, nicotine, heat, chloroform, and things like morphine all increase cholinergic neurotransmitter activation. And the other thing that there's also mechanical receptors inside the atrium and the carotid, which also send information back here, which also help, if they sense a decrease in pressure, then decreases volume, and it basically increases the antidiuretic release. On the other hand, it's reverse. The reverse things are osmoreceptors. If you see a decreased osmolarity, that means you're drowning in your own fluids. So then the body shuts down ADH, and then you begin to basically urinate more rigorously. If you have cholinergic neurotransmitter activation from things like estrogens, progesterone, angiotensin II, and alcohol, will all try to will actually inhibit antidiuretic hormone. And that's one of the reasons that alcohol is also a dehydrator. Okay? And if you drink, there's two reasons why alcohol makes you urinate. One is it suppresses antidiuretic hormone release, and it also acts as an osmotic diuretic. Okay, so the alcohol itself will actually increase your urine output as well. Okay? Increased volume will also be sensed and will suppress antidiuretic hormone by mechanical receptors in the atrium as well as the aortic root. Now, what's important in this picture is that most of the effect is that once antidiuretic hormone is released, it causes an increased permeability of water, which then retains more water. And that's in very important terminology, so please pay attention to that. Okay? A lot of students get caught up on this. Okay? If I tell you that I'm releasing a hormone that increases the permeability of water, that means that permeability is being reuptaking the water. Okay? So the water is being retained by this. Okay? Be careful if I tell you in the test question that it decreases permeability of water, that's not true. Antidiuretic hormone actually increases permeability and increases water reabsorption, and it leads to a more concentrated urine. Okay? Because urine basically has less water in it. Okay? Now, if you look at blood pressure control, the mechanisms that control it are three things. Okay? And that should be delineated very rapidly here. The sympathetics is number one, okay, followed by the angiotensin renin system, and the last one is the aldosterone, the antidiuretic hormone system. Okay. The way the books talk about it is they don't call it the ADH, they call it what? This is what confuses students and it drives me crazy. I don't know why the heck they didn't just leave it simple. Okay. It's vasopressin. Vasopressin is ADH. Okay? Why they had to change it, I don't know. Okay? It drives me crazy. Okay? The reason I guess they had to change it was because it sort of indicate to most students that if you look at most ADH levels that are normally secreted by the posterior pituitary, they have zero or no effect on your blood pressure. Okay? It's only under stressful conditions that they can account to around 4 to 5% of your actual basal tone to your blood pressure. So it's very minor. Okay? Only when you get into really high doses of vasopressin, when you get 40 units of it, when you give it in the code, that's when you get intense vasoconstriction. Okay? But under normal circumstances, vasopressin or ADH has very low activity on peripheral vasculature. Okay? It's not until you get to really high doses that that effect becomes evident. Okay? The other posterior pituitary is oxytocin. Oxytocin is released by activation of mechanical receptors from suckling. So when a baby actually begins to work on the breast, you will see that the woman will begin to contract her uterus. Okay? And that's really a thing that's really important clinically. Okay? And I've seen this really work, okay, where nothing else would seem to be working. We had one lady that was hemorrhaging on us, and her uterus was completely atonic. Okay? We were giving her oxytocin, which was, it's not an endogenous compound. It's something that we produce chemically. And it wasn't seemed to be working, so she either must have had a slightly different receptor than she should have had. So somebody just finally thought of it. It's like, let's put the baby on her. So actually put the baby on her breast and had the baby suckle. Okay, and as soon as it did that, her uterus contracted down and stopped her hemorrhaging. Okay, so that was kind of a neat little trick. Okay. This actually does cause even the sense of visual, visual cues or cries from a baby will cause a cholinergic neurotransmitter release, which then activates the release of the oxytocin. So, it not only drops causes contraction of the uterus, but it also causes the breast glands to eject milk in lactating women. So it has two effects. By far the most important one is the secondary here, which is a contraction of the uterus, which also promotes placental delivery. Okay, let's go on and talk about the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is connected via this extensive blood vessel system. Okay, and you can see it becomes limited at the stalk. Okay, so if you can get a disruption of that, what will happen to all the hormones released by the anterior pituitary? They'll stop, and that's a disease process that I want you to know for the test. Okay, the portal hypophyseal system vessels are pretty vasculature. Okay, they do release this stuff a little slower, but the hypothalamus does release an extensive number of these hormones. Okay, these are large in value. Okay, not small, like only two in the posterior. You have many in the front. Okay, you have the corticotropic releasing hormone, thyroid releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, somatostatin, dopamine, and substance P. So all those are being released by the hypothalamus into this portal hypophyseal system, okay, which then showers down into the anterior pituitary, which then has the effect of causing that cells to release their actual secondary hormone. Okay? Now, the way you pick up which one is a hypothalamus is that if you look at the wording, almost all of them have releasing on it. Okay? Okay? It indicates to you that's the origination point is the hypothalamus. That's the first thing you want to do in taking a test. Okay? Is understand where is the source coming from. Is it coming from the hypothalamus or the anterior pituitary? The only ones that we have to sort of understand is somatostatin, dopamine, and substance P are also released by the hypothalamus as well. Now, once this information is released, it eventually reaches the cells in the anterior pituitary. If you have the corticotropic releasing hormones, it causes a cascade of secondary hormones to be released. So this is sort of mimicking what I told you before. Remember we talked about how a hormone goes to a cell, when it binds to it, then it causes a secondary messenger system, which has sort of a cascade effect. Well, in essence, this is kind of like that, but it's more of a grand scheme. It causes the corticotropic releasing hormone goes to these kind of cells in the anterior pituitary, which then releases things like adrenocorticotropic hormone. That's going to actually affect the adrenal cortex. Then you have beta-lipoprotein, okay, lipotropin, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, and beta-endorphins. Okay, all those are released by corticotropic releasing hormone. As for the somatomatotropins, you have growth hormone and prolactin being produced by that. And the glycoproteins, on the other hand, are thyroid-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone. Regulation occurs via feedback. Usually it's a negative feedback mechanism. It feeds back from the target organ gland hormones, and it tends to have direct effects on the neurotransmitter release that this means released in the first place. Let's look at thyroid. Thyroid basically is a gland that's in your neck. Okay, it originates, believe it or not, in the back of your tongue. Okay, if you look at your, if you stick out your tongue really far, you'll see that there's a little like diamond shape in the back, okay, of it. That's where the thyroid gland actually initiated, and it travels downward into the anterior portion of your neck, going to where it normally is, which is in the anterior element of your, right in front of the trachea. Okay. Sometimes you leave, what's left behind is like this residual tract, okay, which is, you see what's called the isthmus, and you see here, this is the tract that actually goes all the way up, all the way into the thyroid. And sometimes you can see that sometimes the thyroid gland will extend up that area and can cause problems if you have thyroid cancer. Most people don't have that issue. Usually that's a residual and doesn't, gets diluted over time. The thyroid gland does separate up into two components. It has a right and left gland, and eventually it has a connection in the middle, which we call the isthmus. Okay? Behind this gland, which is a completely separate discussion, is the parathyroid gland. The importance of this is that the parathyroid gland is in very close approximation, and if you take out the thyroid gland and you take out the parathyroid gland together, you're going to have hypoparathyroidism, which is something you may not want to desire, and has significant effects on muscle tone. The thyroid gland, on the other hand, has specialized cells inside of it. And the thyroid gland has two cell types. It has follicular cells and parafollicular cells. The follicular cells are the ones that are important in the sense of thyroid hormones, where they're produced. Okay? Inside the follicular cells is this colloid matrix that actually holds in it residual and extra iodine molecules, which you have to uptake from the environment. Okay? And iodine is very much depleted in certain kinds of environment. And if you don't have enough of it, the cells begin to hypertrophy to try to make up for this loss. Okay? So where do you think you see a problem with goiter most frequently? What do you think? Hot, okay? So if I was living in the desert, would I get goiter at a higher frequency? There you go. You got close. It's hot, but it's also humid. It's a high rainfall rate. Okay? A high rainfall rate basically takes the iodine that's inside the environment and washes it away. So those people become much more likely to develop development of goiterism. Okay? So when you lived in overseas in Central and South America, they had a very high goiter rate, okay, until the 1930s. What happened around 1930? Very good. What was the main manufacturer of that? Morton salt. That salt that you guys all get in that blue, okay, if you look at it, it says ionized on it, okay? It actually has iodine added to the salt, okay? And that has been a very, very effective public measure to prevent people from developing goiter, especially people in the tropics, okay, where this used to be a very rampant problem, okay? Every once in a while, you'll still see people come out of the areas where there's still a lot of, they're taking their water directly, and all their plants are in a low area where there's a lot of rainfall, and you'll still see this effect if they're not taking ionized salt. Okay. The parafollicular cells are also located here. And the parafollicular cells, which are the C cells, which are important for calcitonin release, which are ultimately responsible for some degree of calcium regulation, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, there's basically three mechanisms of negative feedback controls for the thyroid hormone. These are located as inhibiting the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and thyroid. Okay? The first hormone that's released, of course, is from the hypothalamus, which is a thyrotropic releasing hormone. This can be increased by things like cold, stress, decreased levels of actually T4. So by suppressing T4 production, you actually will get an increased release of thyroid releasing hormone. Okay? Once the thyroid releasing hormone gets released, it does cause an activation of release of thyroid stimulating hormone, and thyroid stimulating hormone then is the first negative feedback mechanism to suppress the release of thyroid releasing hormone. So that's step one. Step 2 is then that TSH causes the thyroid gland to secrete T3 and T4. T3 affects the system in a dual negative feedback mechanism. It suppresses 1, the thyroid releasing hormone, and that's 2. And 3, it inhibits the thyroid stimulating hormone from being released from the anterior pituitary. So there's 3 negative feedback mechanisms that are available to suppress the release of this mechanism. This is what I've drawn here for you to sort of make it more clear than what the book has done, I think. What I've done for you is in the green is what stimulates it. Things like cold stress leads to cholinergic neurotransmitter release, which then causes the thyroid releasing hormone to be released, and decreased T4 levels, which are T4 levels are located, T4 receptors are located in the brain, which of course located in the hypothalamus, which then induces the release of thyroid releasing hormone. That's why they're green arrows. That means they're stimulatory. You can see it goes down to TSH, which then goes down to the thyroid gland itself, which helps in the conversion of T4 to T3, eventually leading to this negative 3-step mechanism, heat inhibition that take place, which is in the red arrows. Okay? Now the effects of thyroid stimulating hormone in the anterior pituitary is that it produces a glycoprotein which binds to the outer receptor, causing an immediate increase in release of stored thyroid hormone. This increase in iodine uptake and oxidation. There's an increase in thyroid hormone synthesis, increase in synthesis and secretion of prostaglandins as well. So what the end effect is that you get the following. Okay? You eventually get the iodination, T4 and T3 to take place. T4 means that there's actually how many activated iodine compounds to it? 4, okay, versus 3. T3 is just 3 of them. Okay? 90% is T4 and 10% is T3, but guess who's more effective? T3. Okay? So T3 is by far the greatest metabolic effect. Okay? How do you remember that? I have a weird way of remembering it, and if you're a science fiction fan, you'll sort of understand. If you look at Terminator 3, it's much better movie than Terminator 4, Salvation. That was a horrible movie. So that's how I know it's not effective. Okay? So that's how I remember. It's a sick way to remember, but oh well. Okay? Other people have other ways of remembering it. I just don't. That's the way I do it. Okay? Carrier molecule is that you have a thyroxine binding globulin, thyroxine binding prealbumin or albumin. So it requires it's a water-soluble agent, so it has to have, it's a lipid-soluble agent, but it has to have a protein carrier for it. Okay? Synthesis, it needs to be stimulated by thyroid-stimulating hormone. It also needs iodide. If it doesn't have enough iodide present, then it can't produce T4, T3, and you also have healthy follicular cells. When you stimulate the thyroid by thyroid-stimulating hormone, you take the iodine, which is an inorganic or it's called ionic form of iodine. Okay, it's taken in by endocytosis. So literally, the cell uptakes this stuff from the bloodstream and sucks it in. Okay, and of course, what do we think that's going to do? Is that going to be a low energy event or a high energy event? High energy event. Anything that you have to involute and pull into a cell requires a lot of energy. Okay. Iodide then converts into iodine by thyroidal, what's called peroxidase. The actual follicular cells take the uniodinated thyroglobulin, which is produced by the endoplasmic reticulum. Okay? Tyrosine is incorporated into the thyroglobulin as it's synthesized. And then iodide is actively pumped via protein into the colloid, so it sort of keeps it there safely for it. Okay? The iodine begins to bind to the thyroglobulin molecule, and eventually you get a coupling of the iodinated tyrosine forms into different thyroid hormones, which is T3 and T4. And the T3 is really the one that's really active, and the T4 is not. Okay? They're actually then stored and attached to the colloid matrix where it's kept in reserve. Okay? If you think about this, this is a huge step. Okay? That means there's a lot of energy required to do this. Okay? And the reason that the body expends all this energy to do this is because it's the ultimate regulatory mechanism in your body to maintain basal metabolic rate. Okay? So this is a very important hormone. Okay? If you get too much release of this hormone, it begins to actually burn you up. Okay? It's just if you take a fire and you put a bunch of logs in, you make a huge fire, it consumes the wood faster than if you make a smaller fire. Okay? So if you're looking at it from survival-wise, if you need something that cranks you up and keeps you alive for a short period of time, thyroid-stimulating hormone thyroid hormones can be very effective. The downside to them is that it makes you into a hypermetabolic state and will burn you up. Okay? If you begin to release too much of it, the person will become hyperthermic. Their actual cardiac workload tremendously increases, which increases the risk of that person developing an MI. So what you see is T4, T3 being produced. Okay? The effect of thyroid hormones is it affects the growth and maturation of tissue. It increases cell metabolism. And as soon as you increase cell metabolism, that means you consume more oxygen. Okay? You produce more ATP, but you also produce more CO2 and water. If you increase CO2, okay, you must ventilate more rapidly. Okay, so that's increased workload there alone too. Okay, the other byproduct of metabolism is a thing that's not on there, which is heat. Heat's the other third byproduct. It's CO2, water, and heat. Okay, so metabolism is important for production of heat. Okay. And, of course, oxygen consumption is the final end product of this. So instead of having to memorize it, just think about it. Okay? Now we don't have to memorize it. Okay? What do you think it's going to cause? An increase in metabolism, increased CO2, increased water, increased heat, and increase in production of ATP, which is going to require, for that to take place, oxygen as a final electron acceptor in the process. So it requires increased oxygen consumption. So this is what it does when you look at the end organs. At end organs, a conversion of T4 to T3. It stimulates growth and maturation, increased cell metabolism. So you see an increase in CO2 and oxygen production, increase in heat production. If you look at the cardiac cells specifically, it increases the metabolic workload on the cells because of the increased workload. So what you see is an increase in cardiac output. This can be done by two ways. It increases heart rate or increases contractility, or does both at the same time. Sometimes you can actually outstrip the supply, and if you continue this for too long a time, the person will actually develop what's called thyroid cardiomyopathy, or hyperthyroid-induced cardiomyopathy. The muscle literally will burn out, okay, and it will begin to atrophy. Not a good thing. Respiratory-wise, what you see in these people is that the increased CO2 production takes place. That means the ventilatory rate must increase. Okay? Just like the heart has to pump more blood out, okay, and we're talking respiratory once again later on, the lung has to keep up the same amount. Okay? So ventilation goes up. So respiratory rate will go up as well as increasing in the tidal volume. So these people will take in bigger tidal volumes as well as increase their respiratory rate. And if you outstrip the supply, you can actually induce respiratory failure in that kind of patient. And bones, it increases bone reabsorption and begin to lose bone as a consequence. Okay, that's not something you want to do either. Now, negative feedback mechanisms are there to shut the system down. Okay, the way it does it is T4 is very potentiated in the sense of its negative feedback mechanism on the release of thyroid-stimulating hormone as well as the release of thyroid-releasing hormone. Okay, remember also the thyroid-releasing hormone also will inhibit back and release thyroid-releasing hormone on the hypothalamus. Again, to show you the whole negative feedback mechanism is set up a system. Okay? But once you get T4 into your bloodstream, there's really no shutting down the mechanism. Okay? It's only the T4 that comes back to inhibit. Once the cells are actually activated by the T4 or T3, that's going to have to basically shut down over time as the T3 levels and T4 levels begin to decrease. Okay? The reason we know that's true is because we can give it IV-wise, medication-wise, and you mimic this action. Okay? And until you suppress it, by stopping the medication, then you stop the activity that you're seeing. Next gland, the parathyroid gland. Okay, seems like a pretty innocuous gland. It's located posteriorly to the thyroid gland. There's usually around 4 parathyroid glands, usually located behind the upper and lower poles of the thyroid gland. There's 2 on each side. Sometimes there's more than that. Sometimes they're hard to find. Sometimes they're actually in different areas when you think there should be. So if you have somebody with a tumor, the Thyroid glands you can actually have in a different location sometimes, but most of the time, under 95% of the time, you can find them posteriorly to the thyroid gland. The importance of this gland is that it produces a hormone called parathyroid hormone. It's the negative feedback mechanism that actually shuts down the production of parathyroid hormone is ionized calcium. Okay? The other thing that also increases parathyroid hormone secretion are things like normal calcemia and the presence of hypomagnesemia. And that's sort of kind of easy to remember, okay? Because magnesium is very similar in size and also in charge to calcium. Okay, so if you see that somebody's hypomagnesemic, they may actually activate the parathyroid hormone release just like it was somebody who was hypocalcemic. Okay, so even though they're normal calcemic, you can still see an increase in parathyroid hormone secretion. Now, what's very strange is nobody's been able to explain this to me, is that if you get hypomagnesemia with hypocalcemia, then you actually get a very bad effect. Instead of what you should be getting, it's just normally hypocalcemia leads to an increase in parathyroid hormone release. But if you don't, okay, don't see that, okay, you have hypomagnesemia with it, then you don't get parathyroid hormone secretion. Okay, so that's one of the few exceptions. And I don't know why, they always like asking that question on boards. Okay, so I asked you that in the test, because they do ask it on the boards. Okay, so it's one of the few exceptions in medicine where a system that usually will cause an activation now is being suppressed by the other one being inhibited as well. Okay? This is one of the few exceptions in the body. Hyperphosphatemia always leads to hypocalcemia. Okay? Later on we talk about bone reabsorption and things like that. Calcium and phosphate are always going in reverse directions. So if hyperphosphatemia is going up, which means phosphate's going up, calcium levels must fall. If calcium's coming up, phosphate levels fall. Okay, so it's always a reverse. They're on a seesaw. Okay, it never becomes together. If they were to, and I've seen it where you actually do have hypercalcemia and hyperphosphatemia, and it's a terrible event. Okay, one patient we had this going on for about 3 or 4 months, and when we put an arterial line in this individual, we could actually hear the crunching of the artery. When we penetrated the wall of the artery with an arterial line, it felt like you were hitting bone. Okay, so if you have ionized high levels of phosphate and high levels of calcium together, it will crystallize in your bloodstream. And it will basically begin to crystallize along the edges of your arterial wall. What was really more interesting in this is when we were finished, 3 days later they had to pull the A line out, okay, and guess what happened? It wouldn't stop bleeding. Okay, the surgeon came back to try to repair it. He actually opened up the wrist, put a stitch in it, and every time he put the stitch in it, the artery would crumble. So he just finally ligated it and just said, heck with it. He had a good collateral flow, which is why we do an Allen's test, and thank goodness for that. So if we hadn't checked that patient would have been in trouble. Okay, which is the dominant artery of the hand? Would you put a catheter in the dominant artery of the hand? It's the ulnar artery. Ulnar artery is the dominant artery to the hand. The radial is an accessory one. That's why we put it in the radial. Okay, that way what's the incidence of the radial artery occluding when you put an arterial line in? 10%, 20%, 50%, 80%, 100%. Where do you think you're at? Who says 10%? Who says 20%? Who says 50%? Who says 80%? 80%. 80 to 100%. Okay, so that's pretty scary. If you're putting an arterial line in somebody, if you look at them when you pull the catheter out 3 days later, you have no blood flow through it for 3 to 4 days. Okay, so if you don't have good collateral flow to the hand, you'll lose fingers. Okay, so that's why we asked you to do an Allen's test on everybody. I'll talk to you more of that in detail. So here's our schematic here. Let's look at things that will actually stimulate the release of parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone is produced in the parathyroid hormone. Okay, things that will lead to a release of it will be hypocalcemia. That kind of makes sense. Under normal conditions, low calcium levels, you'd want parathyroid hormone to be driven up because then it causes the calcium to increase in your bloodstream. Okay? So ultimately what you're going to see in a minute is that parathyroid hormone usually leads to an increase in calcium in the bloodstream. Okay? But the first thing that it activates, if you take hypocalcemia by itself, it will cause a tremendous increase in parathyroid hormone release. The one that's a little bit less so, but still causes it, is hypomagnesemia with normal calcemia. Okay? So if you have low mag levels, but you have normal calcium levels, you get an increase in parathyroid hormone release, which then increases your calcium even more. What's even more disturbing for us, for a student, is that if you have hypomagnesemia and hypocalcemia, on the other hand, it inhibits this. It's one of the few exceptions. Okay? And one of these days I'm going to ask somebody to do a literature search on that and sort of find that out, maybe for extra credit, but we'll see. The other things that causes inhibition is the negative feedback from increasing calcium levels. And substances that lower cyclic AMP levels would also cause parathyroid hormone to be decreased in its release. The parathyroid hormone affects 3 organ systems, okay? The bone, kidney, and the GI tract. Okay? Ultimately, these things are responsible for depositing greater amounts of calcium into the bloodstream, which is the final path here, which is the blood ionized calcium levels, are what the body is really sensing. Okay? It doesn't sense all total calcium concentration. It actually senses ionized calcium levels, okay? Which is what's important for us clinically as well, because you can have a lot of calcium bound up by protein, and guess what? It's totally inefficient. It doesn't do anything. So it has to be ionized calcium that we're talking about here. Okay? So the 3 systems that are being affected by parathyroid hormone are bone, kidney, and GI tract. And if you think about it from a clearly standpoint of view of where bone has a lot of calcium in it. Okay? So if you get parathyroid hormone, it'll basically break down the bone and reabsorb it, okay, and release calcium in the process. And that's a very important store value. Okay? But really, that's really not where most of the money is at in the sense of how your body regulates calcium in a daily fashion. Most of that is actually regulated at GI tract. Okay? It basically increases intestinal absorption of calcium as well as phosphorus. Okay? But ultimately, the best way to increase your calcium reuptake is usually from nutrition from the GI tract. The things that will actually cause that effect, though, are not direct. The parathyroid hormone basically leads to an increase in calcium reabsorption by the kidney, which is really a minor effect. Okay? But it really causes an effect by decreasing bicarb reabsorption, which causes the metabolic acidosis. But it also helps to activate vitamin D. Okay? Vitamin D is what then activates and causes the GI tract to uptake calcium. So if I don't have any way of having active forms of vitamin D, I get a hypocalcemia. Okay? So I get rickets. Okay? And I begin to lose all my bone because my body is going to keep cranking to try to keep my ionized calcium levels up. So as a consequence, I don't uptake any more in the GI tract because I don't have activated forms of vitamin D. And basically, I deplete all my bone from all my calcium from my bone, and I develop weakness, and I develop bow-leggedness. My chest wall becomes very thin, rachitic, okay, and you basically have a very sick individual at that point. Okay, where did you see rickets in the 1800s? In London. London had a very high concentration of rickets. Okay, and the question is why? I mean, they're not that cold. Coal, fog. Not fog, but smog. If you go to London now, there's no such thing as London fog. That was all misnomer. It was actually smog from the actual coal that they were burning. They were burning so much coal in the city that you couldn't see the sun for 6 months out of the year. And the kids were developing rickets in high amounts. And the people that had money would send their kids into the country. Okay, and the kids that were poor in the city would just stay there and they would develop rickets. Now, produce parathyroid hormone, okay, they're regulators of sodium calcium. Okay, this is another way of looking at it. I showed you the visual way, and I'm going to show you now the written way. Bone, as it regulates breakdown and resorption of bone. Okay, renal-wise, it increases renal absorption of calcium and it helps waste phosphorus. It decreases bicarb reabsorption as a consequence of this, and the person develops a metabolic acidosis as a consequence. It's a potent stimulator of vitamin D as well, okay, which then activates on the intestinal absorption of calcium and phosphorus in the intestinal tract. The final common pathway is that in this process it increases the level of calcium. The antagonist to this is calcitonin, and where's calcitonin produced at? It's not in the parathyroid, it's in thyroid. Okay, remember we talked about the parafollicular cells? Parafollicular cells are the ones that produce calcitonin. They're located in the thyroid gland. Okay, so one is to pull calcium up, the other one is to pull it back down. Okay, so just think about it this way: calcitonin, that means it's toning it down. Okay, so when you hear the word that you have increasing levels of calcitonin, that means you're toning the calcium down and you're dropping your calcium levels. Parathyroid, hormone on the other hand, increases your calcium levels. Okay. Now here's a very difficult question for most students, okay, and it's difficult for me to answer, but I'll give you a good explanation here in the next few minutes. But while you're gone for the next 15 minutes or so, one of the things that the literature will tell you is that hypocalcemia and hypercalcemia will cause muscle relaxation. That's kind of strange. So when you come back, I'll explain that to you. Okay?